Hello, everyone. I have never presented in such a fancy environment, so I'm super nervous. And anyway, we've already mentioned cults, I think, like 5 times in the last couple of days. And now we're about to take a deep dive into this topic. Because my presentation analyzes precisely this question, the proliferation of cults in post-apocalyptic settings, with Metro Exodus basically as a case example. Most of what I will say easily applies to basically every post-apocalyptic game I can think of on top of my head. The main conceptual tool of it's working. The main conceptual tool of this analysis is the notion of resonance. It's the feeling of recognizing something within the game as resembling something outside of it. In this particular case, players and researchers' ability to recognize a fictional organization as somewhat similar to the type of real-world religious organization commonly called cults. This idea is placed in the context of two other important notions. First one is a simulation, which is modeling of one process, in this case cultic behavior, through another video game, with the understanding that some games offer us a simulation of cults. We see a game system behaving in a way that resemble behavior of cults. And this in turn connects to the idea of procedural rhetoric, as discussed by Jan Bogost. Video games can make statements about real-world phenomena using rules as a vessel of communication. So what do video games tell us about cults? And what ideology of the game designers does this reveal? Mark Galanter, in his book Cults, Faith, Healing, and Coercion, defined cults, or as he prefers to call them, and I believe this is more correct, charismatic groups, through the combination of traits. A charismatic group consists of a dozen or more members, even hundreds of thousands. It is characterized by the following psychological elements of its members. They have a shared belief system, they sustain a high level of social cohesiveness, they are strongly influenced by the group's behavioral norms, and they impute charismatic or sometimes divine power to the group or its leadership. It must be said that, to some extent, many of those traits can be easily found, or at least kind of implied, in traditional religions, and I cannot make caveats big enough around the world traditional religions, but we all understand what I'm talking about, hopefully. Traditional religions. However, it is as a combination of those traits that constitutes a charismatic group, with many traditional religions lacking, for example, the very notion of sacred leadership at all, or with many of them focusing on individual practice in accordance with specific holy texts, and so on and so forth. Still, there are plenty of examples of smaller communities and movements exhibiting all characteristics of charismatic groups, while dogmatically being part of Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or other widespread faiths. At the same time, the tendency of charismatic groups to value the words, deeds, and examples of their immanent leadership or their own emergent practice often means that such groups are resistant or at least skeptical of any form of outside control, whether from secular power or from officially higher religious authorities. This is a primary reason for many well-known peculiarities in real-world charismatic groups' religious practices, unbound by the need to adhere to an established tradition through the supposed charismatic power of their leaders. Many such groups are free to experiment, for example, by borrowing some practices from other religions, from other teachings, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, video games love themselves some cults. Cultists is one of the most recognizable enemy in the medium at all, with the history stretching back at least to the numerous cults players had to battle in the original Dungeons & Dragons tabletop RPGs back in the 70s. More modern games like Darkest Dungeon, Baldur's Gate 3, I said, or Far Cry 5, constantly use and reuse the imagery of dangerous charismatic groups as enemies. Post-apocalyptic video games are obviously not an exception. From the Cathedral in Fallout 1, to the Seraphites in The Last of Us Part 2, to the Mushroom Cult in the Item RPG, to the religious branch of Decision in Frostpunk, interestingly, in this case, you as a cultic leader, video games are filled with charismatic groups with strong social cohesion built around a shared belief system and the charismatic traits of leadership or the group's mission itself. Characteristically, the tabletop RPG Legacy Life Among the Ruins, a veritable trove of post-apocalyptic tropes, includes cults as one of the basically default types of post-apocalyptic communities. And this leads me to my two research questions. First, why? What is the function that cults play in video games that makes them so popular? Why exactly game designers return to this topic again and again? And secondly, what understanding of cults, of religion possibly, and of post-apocalypse does this overuse of cult establish? In order to answer those questions, I am analyzing the game Metro Exodus by Ukrainian studio 4A. It is the third installment of the video game branch of Metro franchise, based on the book by Russian writer Dmitry Gluchovsky. In this part of the series, the main character, Artyom, and his companions from Sparta, a fictional organization created by former military veterans to protect humanity, leave the ruins of Moscow on a long journey to find a place where they can rebuild society without fear of mutants, radiation, or scarcity. What makes this game stand out in particular is its almost obsessive inclusion of cults. Metro Exodus consists of six big levels: Moscow, Volga, Yamantau Bunker, Caspian Sea, Siberia, and Novosibirsk, with three levels: Volga, Caspian Sea, and Siberia, presenting a semi-open world style of gameplay with the possibility of completing side missions and making narrative choices. Incidentally, all three of those levels are strongly dominated by different religious groups. If we add to this the fact that Moscow level is basically a tutorial, and the last level, Novosibirsk, features almost no human characters at all due to the extremely high level of radiation and extremely high level of telepathic monkeys in the city, the world of Exodus appears to be an extremely religious place, with the usual cannibals, of course, where would we be without them? Usual cannibals at Yamantau. Sorry, I missed. Okay, let's look at those guys. Stop looking at those guys. At Yamantau being essentially the only society that receives much attention without explicitly resonating with the image of a cult. At first glance, this may appear logical if we look at the situation through the lens of enchantment-disenchantment theory. According to Michael Saller and Charles Taylor, who in turn build upon older tradition established by Adorno, Horkheimer, and back to Max Weber, the modern world is a disenchanted one, bound by three interconnected processes: secularization, rationalization, and bureaucratization. Apocalyptic events, like the one in Metro Exodus, are obviously bound to kind of put a halt to all of those processes, at least to some extent, casting humanity into different types of social structures and therefore forcing upon humans a different worldview better suited to this new situation. The proliferation of cults in such a context would seem to be simply a form of re-emerging religiosity, best suited for small-scale societies that can be entirely run by religious authorities. But there are two important caveats. First, it is crucial to note that cults are by no means the only form of religiosity in the world. In fact, traditional societies during pre-enchanted world, ancient Greece, often lacked any organization resembling a cult or clearly demarcated such groups from the wider society, like in the modern world. Secondly, in Metro Exodus, there are no religious characters outside of cults. Artyom openly states that he is not religious. His companions do not exhibit any religious behavior, despite some of them being old enough to remember pre-world Earth and its teaching. While post-apocalyptic re-enchantment may lend credibility to the proliferation of cults, it does not explain it. Therefore, it is important to take a closer look at the cults themselves. All three religious groups in Exodus share the fact that they are most definitely charismatic groups, exhibiting all the traits highlighted by Galanter: a shared belief system, a high level of social cohesion, strong group norms, and charismatic leadership, with an obviously supernatural reputation. At the same time, on a surface level, there are few similarities among them. The first group, and my favorite one, the Church of the Water Tsar, led by Father Silansi, is based around Volga River. It is a nice, looted bunch with an aesthetic heavily inspired by Russian Orthodox Church. Of course, there's some difference between them and Russian Orthodox, such as a tradition of conducting a sort of God's judgment by exposing followers to the giant mutated catfish called Tsarfish, but it's details. Still, the group itself is encoded as ethically neutral, with the killing of its members being an evil act as recognized by game mechanics, influencing the outcome of this particular chapter as well as the entire story. I won't go into the details of this mechanic, you will have to trust me. The second cult, the fire worshippers, led by Baron in Caspian region, does not have any outright similarity to any traditional religion. And in fact, most of the practices remain unknown, aside from the philosophy of post-Darwinism, which posits that the strongest are right simply because they are strong, along with the religious sanctification of slavery and hyper-exploitation inspired by this philosophy. Still, the game clearly designates them as a cult, with Baron possessing all of characteristical traits of an stereotypical unscrupulous cult leader as envisioned by popular culture. Naturally, the fire worshipper appear completely antagonistic on both procedural and narrative level, with no penalties for killing them and the reward for freeing as many of their slaves as possible. Finally, the last cult, the Children of the Forest, is a group of children who was stranded at a scout camp when World War III occurred. Raised by the camp master, whom they simply called the teacher, they developed skills necessary to survive. It is implied that teacher later committed suicide after realizing that he could not prevent his pupils from becoming as merciless as the people who was threatening them. Aesthetically, children are inspired by tribal and pseudo-Celtic motifs very popular in post-Soviet region, while their practices are derived from traditions established by the teacher as part of his pedagogical practices and general atmosphere of children's camp. Although the teacher himself is already dead, his figure clearly fills the role of charismatic leader, with the phrase teacher would or wouldn't want this serving as a final arbiter in any argument among the children. Similar to the member of the Church of the Water Tsar, children are encoded as ethically neutral on a procedural level and even kind of sympathetic on a narrative level, although ultimately most of the children that player will encounter serves as opponents to be circumvented, ideally, but not necessarily, without killing them. So, three very different religions on the ground level. However, the similarities between those cults become much more pronounced if we analyze them structurally as religions using the methodology of Ninian Smart. As a staunch anti-essentialist and a critic of the Christian-centric approach dominating religious studies of its time, Smart proposed a classification of different practices, views, objects, emotional states related to religion that could be used to organize the imperial material of any religion without any starting assumption about which of those categories is ontologically superior to others, which are more close to what religion truly is. Unfortunately, the small size of my presentation means that I won't be able to elaborate further on those categories. I hope the description and names are pretty self-explanatory, but let's skip to the video game. I propose to organize the elements of in-game religions based on the principle of how prominently they are presented to the player. How often, in connection with religion, do I encounter religious myths or religious practices or sanctified emotional states? And judging by this, what exactly game calls a religion? How does this game understand religion or cults? As more particularly, I organize religious dimension in four groups. Core dimensions are those whose existence is impossible to ignore if the player pays any attention to the narrative side of the game at all. Preferred dimensions are featured heavily, but still require some minimal effort on the part of the player to notice their existence. For example, by paying attention to architecture of important building or particular wording of prominent NPCs. Peripheral dimensions are included in the game, but are present as a completely optional content. They appear in texts that lie somewhere in the background, in a dialogue between unimportant NPC, and in the architecture of peripheral non-important locations. Hidden dimensions are completely absent from the game, although we can assume that they are practiced somewhere there. If we organize the game elements pertaining to cults according to this principle, we arrive at this scheme of religious dimension. Okay, I hope everyone can see it. Otherwise, you will once again have to trust me. Because this is the most important part, because as we can see, at heart of all cults, despite all their differences, lies interconnection of ethical and social dimensions. To belong to the cult is to follow a specific ethics, and that ethics always implies specific approach to organizing and running society. In fact, both Baron and Father Silanti basically admitted that cults they created are vehicles of social engineering. All other dimensions, often extremely important for real-world charismatic groups, like, for example, emotional dimension or ritual dimension, are either completely absent or very toned down in importance in the game. And this, in my opinion, explains the appeal of cults as narrative devices for game designers and as enemies for players. Cults serves as a convenient way to include however weird societies developers can dream of without actually going into the realm of social commentary. This last point is particularly troubling for me when we circle back to the notion of enchantment and disenchantment before, and the idea of modernity as fundamentally connected to the notion of disenchantment. All of those cults, in the end, serve as more or less antagonistic forces for the protagonists. And protagonists, in turn, appear to be as aligned as possible with modern, and I mean our modern, worldview. They act as a sort of disenchanting agent, merrily traveling around the post-Soviet country in their happy train, fighting prejudice and mistakes and correcting people who are just stupid and cannot help themselves but worship a really big fish. Such a narrative consistently implies that the modern worldview, and I mean our modern worldview, is not just the only right one, maybe it is, but it is the only natural one. It is the worldview toward which people tend to gravitate if simply left alone to their own devices. Alternative understandings of the world, for example, religious ones, and alternative ethics may emerge only as a result of either misunderstanding on part of the very traumatized children, who in such context appear kind of sympathetic but ultimately wrong, or from the conscious efforts of individual bad actors trying to shape society towards their personal needs and philosophies. And this is very weird because on the surface level, one would assume that the very idea of apocalypse, especially a man-made apocalypse, as World War III, would serve as kind of starting point to criticize modernity and call for an alternative. Thank you very much. That's it for me.